All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Tim Siglin. I'm a contributing editor for StreamingMedia.com, Streaming Media Global. And today we're going to talk about some of the findings from a research report that was done in the last few months. Are you getting a bit of feedback on this? Okay. All right. Out of curiosity, did anyone in here actually take the survey that we did on Second Screen that was available on StreamingMedia.com, StreamingMediaGlobal.com? Okay. So nobody in here had the chance to win the free iPad that was offered. The project came about as a collaboration between Pixel. Pixel is a company that was formerly known as Kit Digital. They're actually based in New York with offices across Europe. And Unisphere Research. Unisphere Research is the research and analytics arm of Information Today. Information Today is the parent company of Streaming Media as well. And so the idea with the project, as with most sponsored research, is that Pixel and Unisphere wanted to gain some insight into the way that second screen apps were used. And also, as we went through the process, take a look at perhaps viewing patterns from respondents. I was tasked through my company, which is Transitions Incorporated, I was actually tasked to create the methodology, create the questions, do the analytics afterwards, and publish the report. So, initial discussions and the first draft of questions that I put forward were looking at marketplace opportunities from the standpoint of a viewer. One of the things that we typically tend to want to know is how are people using applications? So that was the initial idea, was to take a look at that and understand the marketplace opportunity through the standpoint of a viewer. But then when we thought about it, we realized that one of the things that we had with readers of StreamingMedia.com and StreamingMediaGlobal.com is that many of these people were not only consumers, but also creators of the tools for second screen applications. So we thought that that was interesting and that we needed to look at an approach that maybe encapsulated both of those. So we set up the survey through a series of questions, some questions of which we're asking the respondents to take a look as experts in the industry and tell us what they saw in terms of second screen usage from an application standpoint, from a design and development standpoint. But then we also said, tell us your own viewing habits. And we wanted to understand there, if we are the industry leaders in terms of creating the apps or creating the tools for the apps, what kind of viewing patterns do we in the industry have? So that was the basis of how we proceeded with the survey. So the end result is multiple paths to analyze, not just current state viewing habits, but also industry future trends. The first section on viewing habits, I'm going to actually walk you through some typical charts and tables, and then when we get into the second section, I'm going to switch over to the actual report. And at the end of this session, if you'd like to, if you give me a business card, I'll send you a copy of the report. Typically what you'd have to do is sign up through a process on the website, but there's an agreement that we can actually provide everybody who attends a copy of the report. And I think it's really fun reading. I had a lot of fun actually creating both the questions and the analysis. So section 1 dealt with contextual questions around thinking about the viewing habit as the person who responded, not as an industry expert, but just tell us how you watch content. This is responder as viewer. The second section, we wanted to look at questions as to where the industry is heading. So if you work within the industry, are you someone who works on content production? Are you someone who works on second screen app development? Or somebody who creates the tools for those? Where do you think the industry is going? And then finally, a forward-thinking set of questions to do additional opinions. So we asked some free-form questions. We wanted to understand what we hadn't potentially covered in the survey and ask people to work from that standpoint. So section 1, these are some of the charts and graphs about that. We asked a question, which of the following do you consider your second screen when viewing content? And of course, people were allowed to choose one. You'll notice tablets, smartphones far and away dominate. But what's interesting is desktops and laptops are actually still fairly strong, about 26%. And then interestingly, and I don't make a whole lot out of this, that television being considered the second screen, that would be people who would tend to consume on a tablet as their primary or a smartphone as their primary, and who fall back to television. That kind of a scenario might be something like the World Cup, where you may consume a significant amount of content, but then you need to go to a pub if you don't have a television at home to watch the game. So that's one model for that. Then we asked how many favorite shows that our respondents as viewers used a second screen around. And what's interesting here is the sweet spot, the majority almost seems to be 2 to 3 shows, but if you take 1 to 3 shows, you can see that that's clearly, so the pattern, at least within people in the industry, is they tend not to use a second screen application for more than 3 shows. Consumption mode, the question here is, do you watch your favorite shows live or time shifted? We actually had 3 options for people. 1 was live, 1 was time shifted, and the third was both. And what we did is we took the average of both and added it into time shifted and live. So if you took that away, time shifted would actually, from a proportional standpoint, be even more dominant. So it appears that in the industry, those of us who work in online video tend to be much more likely to consume on a time-shifted basis than on a live basis, which sort of means that we're drinking our own Kool-Aid from that standpoint, that we really understand that there's a benefit to doing that. Now, this one was pretty interesting to me. So we're technically savvy. We watch stuff, we tend to watch things time-shifted, but during live shows, during our favorite shows that we watch live as opposed to time-shifted, do we use one of the primary social media tools to actually interact with others, tweeting about an event? And 87% of respondents said no. I'm not an active Twitter user from the definition that we provided to them, which was 2 shows a week. Now, if you look at genres like sports, and again, we come back to the World Cup, the likelihood is if you ask something specific around that, you would get a higher percentage that said, yes, I tweeted during 2 games. But what's interesting is we delved down through, and you'll have to read this in the report, as we delved down through, we found that a lot of those tweets were sort of, people describing their use of tweets during sporting events was to sort of harass somebody else who was for the opposing team that was a friend. So the tweet was almost more of a personal jab as opposed to being a, let me tweet on the bigger social platform, which I found interesting. This one too was sort of intriguing. When a show's airing live, if a friend recommends it to you on Facebook, Twitter, or other social media, do you watch the show immediately or later? Immediately was right around 10%. Another 10% said the next time an episode comes on television, I'll watch it. A higher number on catch up and or time shifted. And then we may be a bit curmudgeonly in the industry because almost a third of us said, you know what, we just ignore recommendations from other people about watching shows. And that pattern sort of repeated itself multiple times through some of the findings, which was intriguing. This one, we said, okay, assume you're watching live and go through a ranking model tell us what live genres you tend to, or what genres you tend to watch live. And if you look at these, the numbers look fairly close, 20, 21%, 23, et cetera. But because of the ranking model, it's effectively a logarithmic. So 23 is significantly higher than 21, meaning the dominant live viewing habits for our industry are people will watch news and they will watch drama and sports sort of equally on live, and we can't really figure out why comedy ranked so high, but maybe you figure that you want to be in on all the jokes at the same time that everybody else is. Who knows from that standpoint, but news far and away, and that does track fairly consistently to the industry that we heard from a viewing habit standpoint. Is breaking news is something that people will switch to live because obviously you want to hear that in the moment. This next one was also pretty fun. Tell us how you communicate with others during a live TV show. So forget how you interact with the content on screen. How do you interact with other people? And when we provided this, and I will say, well, I'll hold that thought for a second. When we provided this, we provided these lists of options for people to choose. Other, which came in at about 20%, very, very consistently was face-to-face. And in fact, we got dinged numerous times in the comments on other saying, how come you didn't give us a face-to-face option? Because that's what we tend to do. Or the other thing that fit in the other category was, I just don't talk to anybody else during a show. If you talk while a show's going on, you're out of the room. Or I'm gonna go somewhere else and watch the show because I don't want anybody talking to me at all, which we found was interesting. Phone call, I would assume people would do that perhaps, you know, in countries where there's a commercial break, they might do that during a commercial. Or maybe they're just multitasking if it's, you know, if it's teenagers. WhatsApp and Viber didn't rank very high, but we primarily had a North American audience responding to this. So I would say if we did this solely in Europe, we would find that those would rank a bit higher. If we did it in somewhere like India solely, they would rank significantly higher. So to me, that pattern is more just the way the respondent model was, rather than the fact that WhatsApp or Viber aren't important. Does anybody have any questions on this one or any of the previous slides that I've shown? Okay. So how do you interact with the primary screen content? And again, remember, these are people in the industry, quite tech savvy, tend to watch more time shifted than live. Almost 60% said they don't interact with the content at all. So if you go back to this previous one where we say almost 20% said face-to-face or no interaction at all, and then you with others around you, and then you come to this where we have no interaction with the primary screen content, it begins to paint a picture of the fact that if we in the industry aren't acting or aren't interacting with the primary screen content, we aren't interacting with others, we may end up, it may just be that we're an industry of hermits or people who don't talk to one another, or, and this is something we explored in the report, it's possible that the things that we are pitching as second screen application benefits aren't necessarily the benefits that consumers want. And that was sort of an intriguing insight to start looking at. The other thing here is if you look at it, show applications rank at 10%. So if you have an application that's primarily geared toward a single show, that is close to the bottom in terms of the way that people interact with content. What we really see is that from a Facebook and Twitter standpoint, those would be where you're putting the message out to others that this is what you're watching, this is why you're watching it. IMDb is much more, I have personal curiosity. what other shows was this actress in, what other shows did this particular director do. So we found that to be an interesting stat as well. And then finally, viewing recommended Netflix content, so going to a very specific time-shifted application where we talked before about how people dealt with recommendations. Here, the question was, how often do you view content recommended for you in Netflix? We weren't asking how quickly it happened, we were asking how frequently it happened. And what you see is that it's fairly evenly split between weekly and monthly. But if you take rarely, which brings you closer to ignoring recommendations, you see that that's a bit bigger than either the weekly or monthly. And then a most fascinating point is that 38% of the respondents, people who work within our industry, who are technically savvy, who watch time-shifted content, don't have Netflix. And especially if the majority are in the North American audience, that's just an utterly fascinating statistic. That's one that I personally tagged for Pixel if they want to continue the research forward to drill down into to understand why we in the industry aren't using something like Netflix. And out of curiosity, here in the room, and I understand that not everyone's from the UK, but how many people actually have Netflix as a subscription service? Okay. And of course, the Netherlands. What country?
Sweden.
Sweden? UK. UK as well, okay. Those of you who are in the room that don't have it, is it because you're in a country that it's not offered in? Okay, you shake your head no. Why don't you have it?
I use for already. Yeah.
Not to put you on the spot or anything.
I watch quite a lot of video anyway as part of my day jobs. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting, when I worked in the broadcast world, I had a television at home, but I hardly turned it on because, that's work, and you don't want to be analyzing constantly the problems on something that you see in a show. So for you, do you watch short online video clips on YouTube or something like that, or when you come home, you just say, I'm a Luddite at this point of the day?
Kind of once a year when Game of Thrones is on.
Okay. Okay, interesting. One other quick statistic here in the in section 2, and this was a question that we asked. This again is not looking at a personal viewing habit, although many respondents sort of gave us the feedback that this is what they did. We said, okay, if you were a consumer and you heard a particular song on a show, how would you find the information out about that? And we left that as a free-form answer. We didn't provide any list for them to choose from. What's interesting is that you can see that discovery tools like Shazam and SoundHound make up about 30% of it. YouTube, what people said for YouTube was about what they said for Google, which is, well, I may know the name of the show, so I'm going to type in, soundtrack for a particular show, and if you knew the name of the episode, you would. So that's also discovery. It's discovery on a little more difficult process. But if the song's played and all the way through, and you haven't turned on Shazam or SoundHound, that would probably be the process that you would do to find out what it is. A few other people said iTunes and IMDb ranked in there. Bing. I don't know if that's indicative of Bing's market share, but 1%. Yeah, and I find I use Bing on occasion just to see what isn't showing up there as opposed to what is. So I may do a Bing search and I'll get a few responses and I'll think, I don't think that's full. Then I'll go to Google and I'll get a much fuller model. So anyway, that's sort of interesting. One quick thing before I switch over to parts of the survey itself. One thing that's provided within the report at the end is we wanted a way to get feedback from people in terms of what they thought about the report, things that we missed, questions they had. So this email address, secondscreen2014pixel@streamingmedia.com, really long, unfortunately, but the idea is that we do one of these for each of the surveys now. That will provide feedback directly to me as both the methodology and author of the questions, and then the analysis. I'm very, very keen to understand if there are problems that people have with the survey data and like that. So that one, now, I'm going to switch over real quick. And I'm going to run through a series of the questions on a just raw data basis. Let me get back over to, you can't see that, sorry. Let me move this over onto the screen. So we went through and we looked at all of these, the personal viewing habits. Now, we, number 11 and number 12, these are both projected. So this is shifting to the model of saying, tell us what you think, if you're sitting a year out or 2 years out, what has happened in the meantime? And that's what we call backcasting, where effectively we want to say, you're the expert, you're sitting out there, what do you see? What are the things that people have used? And so we had seen earlier sort of what people use in terms of apps. Here we said, okay, 18 months, 2 years out, what are people actually using as apps? So don't tell us how you use it, tell us what you think will be used. And what's interesting about this is Twitter in the previous one was 7%. Here, people think, from an industry expert standpoint, people think that Twitter usage will rise. WhatsApp stays about the same. Facebook rises some, but the combination of Facebook and Twitter together with the idea that people will use both of those sort of interchangeably actually rose very dramatically. We still have a group of people who say, not going to use an application, but that has shrunk from the usage questions that we asked. So this is, again, projecting forward 18 to 24 months. What do we see in terms of most used applications? Show specific also stays fairly small, which I think is interesting. So even those in the space who worked in second screen application creation or tool development say that they don't necessarily see show specific apps as being a significant driver in terms of what people use. Then in question 12, we said, what do you think consumers would prefer if they had only one choice of a catch-up service or the ability to do TV everywhere, meaning being able to watch live television on their tablet or mobile device? And far and away, the response was that a catch-up service would be much more preferable for viewers. This question we said, tell us how long it will take for the second screen to become the primary media consumption device, meaning if today you use this as your second screen app or a tablet, how long will it take until this becomes the primary way that you consume content or through either a smartphone or a tablet? The majority, obviously almost 2/3, say it will take at least 5 years to get there. The only real interesting piece for me on this was 10% of the people said it already is, but I can correlate that almost directly back to people who kind of look at television as the second screen. So it's kind of a consistent pattern between those two things. This question was, if you have a network-based DVR and you have content on that, will you tend to watch that on the primary screen or the secondary screen? Far and away, over 2/3 said we'll watch that on the primary screen. So even though you have equal option to watch it on your smartphone or tablet, you'll tend, if you've got content that's been DVR'd on the network, you'll tend to watch that on the primary screen. Not much of a surprise there, but just a good reminder that that's the case. Question was that this starts shifting now into questions around features and functionalities on second screen application tools. How important is it to have a common development platform? No question. For multiple types of devices, Android devices, iOS, common platform is a very important piece. I'm going to skip over 16 for a minute. I'll come back to that. Well, actually, I will touch briefly on this one. Let me find the details here. So the questions that we asked in this dealt with, and I'll flip over to the raw data here, and you can see this. Make sure that I'm in the right place. Just a second. Let me come back to that toward the end because I need to find the raw data on that. This, from an application standpoint, again, application development, what are the primary features? Again, we asked people to prioritize these, so 21 to 19 is a fairly significant drop. It's logarithmic. When you ask for developer features and how to prioritize those, the top 3 are social media integration, single sign-on, and content security. And those 3 are even more important than having an integrated development environment. And even though we had the previous question that asked how important is it to have a common development platform, here, when faced with a question about the trade-off between having a common development platform or having some of these other features to be able to make sure that you had content security, single sign-on, and social media integration, those actually rise higher. And social media integration is interesting for us because it ranks high in the developer's mind about what they want, but in reality, if we go back to see standalone second screen apps for shows, we find that those are very low on viewer usage. So one of the questions that we sort of posited off this that requires some future research is, do we look at models that say you don't integrate social media into your app, but you go the opposite direction and figure out how to integrate your app into the social media platform itself? So do you do a plug-in to Twitter? Do you do a plug-in to Facebook so that those things are that you want to deal with on a show-specific basis don't sit in a standalone second screen app? They actually sit as part of the larger Facebook or Twitter platform. In this one, number 20, we looked at recommendation types and the prioritization of those. And again, this isn't necessarily personal usage, but the question here is, where do you see the ranking of priority for recommendations? And you can see that personal recommendations still rank extremely high. Sponsored recommendations are very low comparatively. Auto sits somewhat in the middle. Trending recommendations tend to be much more trusted than sponsored recommendations or automatically generated recommendations, meaning a suggestion engine like Netflix. If you like this, you'll like this and this. The reason that we think trending came up higher on this is the idea with trending is like Twitter. If you go look at a Twitter feed, you'll see the trending tweets or the hashtags. We think that what people are saying here is the personal recommendations are the ones that I trust the most, but if everybody else is also watching a piece of content, which is where trending would be, then that's something that I need to pay attention to as well. Kind of like in the United States, you know, very few people like football or soccer until the World Cup comes on and all your friends are talking about it, and suddenly ESPN has massive ratings for soccer this week.
So, Tim, sponsored just means advertising, is it?
Correct. That would be the kind of thing that if you're sitting, you know, so if you're sitting on Facebook over on the bar on the right-hand side, there are 3 recommended ads. If you're sitting on Google, there's, you know, AdSense, that type of thing. So yes. And those are typically clearly delineated in recommendation tools as being sponsored, which is a good thing. But what's interesting is the more they're delineated as being sponsored, the less likely people are to click on them. So then we said, all right, tell us if personal recommendations are top, what kinds of things could potentially supplant personal recommendations? And you'll notice here again, first of all, you know, almost 40% of the respondents said nothing will ever supplant personal recommendations, but that trending comes up very high at 1/3 of the total respondents saying, yes, this is something that we see could potentially supplant personal recommendations. So this is my friends tell me something is good. This is everybody in the world tells me something is good, or you know, the majority of the people in the trend category. Over time, will personal recommendations for pre-aired content, in other words, for on-demand content, grow or diminish? And the feeling is that personal recommendations will continue to grow for content that's, you know, available on something like Netflix, YouTube, catch-up services, that type of thing. Now, looking again at features for developers, the question that we asked was, how important is show synchronized content? If you as an, the question here was you as an expert, what do you feel is important in terms of having content that's synchronized with the show at the time the show is on? Is that important to you or not important? And you can see that a little over half said it's important, and if you combine that with very important, you're looking at over 2/3 saying that show synchronized content. So the idea of a second screen app being able to synchronize content with a live event on air makes sense, or at least experts felt that that would be something that would be important. Then we said, okay, fine, what are the content priorities for different categories that you would need to synchronize? And what I find interesting on this is we offered up a series of content models like backstory, extra or deleted scenes, sneak previews, and actor bios. Actor bios came out low, but if you remember back to the chart that we looked at earlier, or the graph we looked at earlier, IMDb was fairly high in terms of what people use it for. So this is an area that I think there's a bit of a disconnect between what we as experts think that consumers want and what we as viewers actually do in terms of searching for information. So I think that's important. And Backstory is very fascinating because that's also sort of like IMDb, because you go to IMDb if you're in the middle of a movie. If you come in halfway through the movie, you go to IMDb to sort of read the synopsis so that you can catch yourself up to it. Or if you wonder whether the movie's still worth watching, you read the full synopsis with the spoilers to decide whether you want to watch to the end. One question we asked was exclusive non-synchronized content. So again, sort of going back to some of these things with extra scenes and deleted scenes, how important was it? And this one, there wasn't, I mean, very important and important together. Show that exclusive content makes sense, but wasn't a breakout category here necessarily. Then we said, okay, if we're talking about synchronized content on a second screen application, what do we think that people will pay? What's the threshold we think that people will pay to watch exclusive content during the time that a show is airing? And we went from everywhere from 50 cents, 50 US cents, to $10. And you can see, if you think about the way that this chart works, what we're saying is, you know, where's the pain point that people will stop paying? Almost a third of people said the pain point is going to be at 50 cents or lower. And if you take that plus the dollar together, you can see we're well over into the majority category, so that we as industry experts answering the question as to what consumers would bear are saying that on a exclusivity basis, this is sort of the threshold that people would be willing to pay. Then we sort of took that a bit further and said, okay, fine, this is during airing, so you see the dollar and the 50 cents together. And we said, what would they pay to be able to watch it one day after airing to watch the exclusive content? And you see here the tolerance is much lower because there's a much bigger percentage that would only pay 50 cents or lower. So the exclusive content during, the takeaway from this is the exclusive content during an event that's live on air, there's more tolerance to pay for that than there is even a day later after the content has aired. Not much of a surprise there, but what's interesting about this is that we as industry experts answering this, thinking about what consumers would be willing to pay, clearly know that consumers aren't willing to pay a whole lot after content has actually been aired for the first time or during a live event. I'm going to skip over 28 and 29. We asked a similar question here in pricing. What would the threshold be to eliminate all ads for 1 month if you're watching? I believe the way we asked this question, let me jump over to the actual question here. So for one of them, we said for catch-up service, what would consumers be willing to pay per month to eliminate ads in one show each week? And then what would they be willing to pay for a month to eliminate the ads in all the shows in a catch-up service? So those are the questions, and this is the 1 month response. Okay, so what we as industry experts felt people would be willing to pay, we think that that the model would go up to about $5. That seems to be close to consensus. Anywhere below $5 is okay. Above $5, it drops off fairly rapidly. When you look at the question in eliminating ads from one show a week, the tolerance again is down in the 50-cent range. So here the idea would be, I as a consumer consume a large amount of content. I'm willing to pay for a subscription service with no ads, which would be a model like what Hulu Plus initially started out as. And so this would be my subscription service to watch content that eliminates ads. This one down here says, I got a favorite show and I want to be able to watch that favorite show ad-free. And again, understanding that that's a model that doesn't correlate across all of Europe because of things like the BBC where it is ad-free. But if you were faced with that, where would the tolerance be? And the tolerance is well below $1. Any questions on those particular charts? I mean, to me, that it's fascinating that even though we do work in the industry, we understand that there are thresholds for, for consumers and what they are willing to pay for things. And let me go back up. These questions, 28 and 29, we were asked to include from the sponsor, from Pixel, because they wanted to understand whether there was a need for consumers to store advertisement. So the idea here being, say for 29, viewers wanting to store ads on a second screen device for later viewing, meaning I'm watching an ad on the primary device, there's a synchronization, and I decide that I want to watch that later. Would I be likely to actually store that on my second screen device to watch? And you can see, if you look here, currently the assumption is that only about 1% would be more than half likely to do it, and that over 80% would be very, very unlikely to do it. The projection changes a small amount for the highly likely to do it, and it drops a bit from the less likely to do it, meaning that there's slightly more of a balance, but you can see that even as industry experts answering this, we don't necessarily think this is something that people will use. So it was interesting for us to put those questions in there. And when you ask that question to somebody and say, do you want to store an ad on your second screen device to watch it later? They say, I don't want to watch ads at all. Why would I want to store them? So that was sort of an interesting piece. And then over here, a similar question, but saying, do you want your second screen device ads to mimic or augment the primary screen ads? And in this case, the idea there would be being, if the ad was showing on the primary screen and was talking about a trip to Hawaii, would you want your second screen app to actually show you a secondary video or something like that? And there's a little more tolerance for that, but again, still very unlikely for 55% and only highly likely or more than likely for 6%, as we have down here at the bottom. So it's almost 11:20. That gives us about 10 minutes for questions and answers. And you can ask me questions. If it's something that I didn't cover in here, ask me a question about it, and I'll see if I can answer that.
The recommendation questions,
Mm-hmm.
Personal / sponsored,
Right.
whatever they were.
Let me get back up here. Okay, right.
Yeah, this lot.
Mm-hmm.
What does auto mean there? 21, question 21.
So auto would be, if you have something like Netflix, they build algorithms in Same thing as YouTube builds algorithms in. You watch a particular piece of content on YouTube, and there's an automatic suggestion to you of other things you might like. Similar to if you're using, say, Spotify for audio, listening to a particular song, it may say, if you like this, you might also like this. So those are basically algorithms that have been designed to hopefully mimic and find things that you might like. It's different from sponsored, where sponsored says, I don't care what you're watching, I'm going to throw this out that you need to watch this other
Just
thing.
go back to the previous question.
Mhm.
Right. There's one that I'm seeing, for example, World Cup now. And,
Mhm.
I remember people used to, as a joke, put under their signature, there must be an app for that.
Right.
And, and I'm just finding that people assume that there probably is a second screen app that is probably called FIFA.
Okay.
And no one has recommended it to them. They've not seen any advertising for it.
Hmm.
There's not actually been any kind of trending that they're interested in.
Right.
They just assume that, and Wimbledon's just started yesterday.
Right.
Therefore, guess what? You go to Play Store or whatever, and you find FIFA. And amazingly, it's brilliant.
Yeah, so it's a common assumptive model. In maybe another scenario, and that is, we're almost into July. That means the Tour de France must be running. So where in France can I go to watch it? Well, if you try to go watch the opening stages in France, that's not going to work because it's going to take place in England this year. So it's interesting you say that. I don't know if there's a way to necessarily quantify gut feel. But you're right, there is always that feel that there must be something that I need to augment. If we can figure out, and that probably gets into auto at some level, but it's more of an AI type of model for auto to say, if you like FIFA and if you like Formula One, I probably shouldn't give you NASCAR recommendations. Part of it's the elimination models as well that would help make the auto a bit better to work with. So that's a good point.
I just wanted to ask about betting. Is
Mhm.
that seen as second screen? So if there's a World Cup match, England, Costa Rica this afternoon, people betting online
Mhm.
on their devices, is that second screen viewing and is that covered here?
So I think one of the issues you would have, just my personal opinion, I think one of the issues you would have, and I came out of the video conferencing world before I came into this world, one of the reasons that betting locations used, say, video conferencing tie-ins as opposed to satellite broadcast or definitely online is the latency issue. So if you have a horse race that lasts 25 seconds, you want to make sure that the bets go in and you see how things are happening live. So yes, a second screen, but it would be second screen that wouldn't include video necessarily because you would have the problem of the significant latency. So it would be much
What
more.
I'm saying is that if you're watching a match,
Mhm.
the England match,
Right.
who's going to score the next goal?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're doing that, is that second
Doing
screen?
it from a formal betting standpoint,
Yes.
that would be second screen, or you would have the traditional models of calling it in, something like that.
But in UK with betting, it's 3 seconds is the Ofcom rule.
Interesting.
Certainly Ladbrokes Windmill have now
Right.
resolved that.
Right.
Level 3, they deliver within 3 seconds.
What I would probably see on that is it would be, to me, that would be, it's a betting application that also has awareness of what live events are occurring at a given time. So it's not that it necessarily synchronizes to the primary screen content, it's that they both occur at the same time. And so the database used to drive that would be built from a betting standpoint. The platform itself would not necessarily be beholden or require you to be watching the content on the primary screen.
So I think the big trend or fashion in the UK with Formula 1 and the
Mhm.
things that Sky and BBC are doing right ones, the highlights or live.
Right.
Tour de France.
Right.
Eurosport is the live till 4 and then ITV4 is 4 till midnight.
Correct.
So you have two broadcasters
Mhm.
competing for the same content. And with betting, what seems to be happening is that they're going under to GPS, so they put trackers on the cyclists and
Right.
horses, and they're now doing animation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a virtual. So you have 3 broadcasters. You have the betting company. You have 2 broadcasters at the same time, showing the same material.
And Interestingly, I worked with a company a number of years ago in Austria that had a system that gave much more rapid feedback within an arena than GPS did even, and theirs was used heavily in horse racing because they could get 1,000 points of data per second, so they could really actually get much, much closer to real time. So, yeah, interesting point.
Do you have any time-related results? For example, time-shifted watching after 8 p.m. or before?
We did not, we chose not to do that. There are studies out there that have done that to look at sort of the prime time models, you know, whether it's during work hours, whether it's during traditional prime time models. We didn't feel we had a large enough sample set of general consumers. Again, the group that we were focused toward are people who both work in the industry and consume content themselves. I think if we did additional studies, we could look at something like that, but you'd have to correlate that data. You have to make sure that it was the same people answering the questions as answered this to sort of be able to draw those conclusions.
Because many people, working people, are on the way to work, have breaks,
Mm-hmm.
lunch break or something like that.
And watch content.
Especially in the news sector where I work, it's interesting, when do they work, do the break,
Mm-hmm.
what do they do in their breaks, and on the way to travel.
And do you have an application within your organization that people can actually watch the news content? And if so, do they watch it in clips or do they watch it live?
We are producing special interest content.
Okay.
So it's our daily business to serve this content the whole day because it's only live or on demand, but it's a small application.
And is it fairly timely content, or can I watch it a week from now and not have
It's
much?
different. It's exclusive live, and then we have this model like you show there for less money. You can watch it an
Mhm.
hour later, or you can take an abonnement and with the whole month, for example. It's Simon and Netflix trying to get money.
Oh, sure. And paywalls for newspapers and news is a huge issue.
Mostly news, of course.
Right. Exactly. Did somebody else have a question?
I was just wondering about the synchronized content that you were talking about, and the examples that you had up there all seem to be quite drama-centric in terms of backstory and so on. Did the question specifically focus on drama there? Or
Let me get this. Let me get the screen back up, and I'll show you what the raw question was. So let's see, the raw question on that particular one, if it likes me. Hang on, I'm just going to disconnect and then I'll find the details. So you were asking around the questions about backstory and the like, is that right?
Yeah, what
Okay. So what we did with that particular one was we worked with Pixel with some of the things that they offered, and that specific question was somewhat standalone, of course, based against the theoretical idea around dramas and like that. We've recommended for them, if they go forward, to actually do something similar around sports and do something similar around news, to understand that when you craft questions, you don't necessarily know where you're going to start getting your touch points. And obviously where we found that news was very high, in hindsight, to have asked a similar question around this to news would have been a good thing, but that's something that we want to look at going forward. So, all right, time for one last question.
Yeah, just some of the questions that you asked people about what they would be willing to pay to eliminate ads entirely.
Mm-hmm.
Did you factor in things like ad block and no script that would let people do it free?
We did not, on the assumption that The industry is getting smarter in that, where you look at what Unicorn has done. Brightco obviously acquired them, where they're stitching the ads directly in as a single stream. We assume that there'll always be a cat and mouse game from that standpoint, but that the general consumer would tend not to be savvy enough to understand how to do something like that. So that's a very good question. And I think the industry knows it has to keep ahead of things like ad blockers, which means they have to get rid of playlists, which means they have to stitch the content into a single stream. And then I think once the industry stabilizes from that standpoint and they know that they can force you to watch the ads, then they'll start off figuring out where the price thresholds are. So right now, it's sort of hard for them to argue to do that because, people who are savvy can at least block the ads completely. So, okay, well, if there are no other questions, thank you all for coming, and please give me a business card if you'd like a copy of the actual survey.